Right. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everybody who's joining us today, depending on which time zone you are. Very happy to welcome you to this event of GMF. My name is Nick Bouchet. I'm a visiting fellow with GMF, and it's my pleasure today to host this discussion on a project that GMF was very pleased to support regarding an exercise of scenarios about the future of Russia to 2030 with a specific view from Central and Eastern Europe. I will say a little bit more about the project in a second, but first let me just very briefly welcome and introduce our speaker in order in which they will go. First is Pavel Havlíček, a research fellow for the Association for International Affairs in Czechia, AMO, Adam Balcer from the College of Eastern Europe, where he's research director in Poland, Kadri Liik, who's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and finally Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti, who's a research fellow from the Italian Institute of International Political Studies in Milan. We have a great group of experts, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting conversation amongst them and hopefully with the audience. An early request to the audience: if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will pick them up as we go along. Now, we only have two of our speakers, Eleonora and Kadri, until about 4:30 Berlin time, so for about 1 hour. So we will try to be fairly prompt in our discussion to give them as much time as possible to intervene while we have them. We can certainly go beyond that time also for further conversations with Pavel and Adam. As I mentioned, this project was an initiative from AMO, the Association for International Affairs, and in collaboration with the College of Eastern Europe, and GMF was very happy to support this exercise and to follow it along. And this is, in a way, the final point of that process and that collaboration. This is also in some connection with our Rethink CEE fellowship, of which Pavel is a fellow of a class of, I think, 2022, possibly, if I remember correctly. The Rethink CEE fellowship is a fellowship for young, up to 35 years old, policy analysts, thinkers, academics, activists, NGO workers from Central and Eastern Europe to try and encourage new voices from the region to address policy issues in the most broad sense that affect the region, both regionally, but also in sub-regions or at the country level. And Pavel was one of our second or third wave of fellows, and we are now going to be advertising for the 2025 fellowships later this year. So by all means, if you are interested in applying and you are young enough and from the region, or if you know people who fit the bill, by all means, please look out for the GMF website later this year. It's a very useful and interesting fellowship to take part of, and it is a very interesting group of alumni that we have built over the last few years, and it's a good community to be part with in the context of research on policy issues in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't want to talk too much more. How we will do is Pavel will speak first and introduce a bit more the project and the scenarios that were built. Then we will go to Adam, who will then go a little bit more in depth in terms of the policy implications of the scenarios and of recommendations, both for the Central and Eastern Europe as a region, as countries, and also for the wider European and transatlantic community. We felt when this idea was brought to us as a potential project, that it was a very interesting and important and timely occasion to encourage a Central and Eastern Europe specific conversation about the many scenario exercises that have been taking place about Russia, especially since February 2022. There was a process which I won't go into in great detail here because it's not directly relevant. It included workshops that took place in Prague and in Poland, many individual also consultations that were conducted by Pavel and Adam and their colleagues. This was then brought together in this paper, and we are now doing dissemination events, and Pavel and Adam will also be bringing this to the different parts of the region, but also outside of Central and Eastern Europe. On that basis, I think I will go back to you, Pavel, straight away, so you can talk maybe not so much about the process and the rationale, because I think it should be fairly obvious in the context of Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, the security and foreign policy imperatives that are involved, but also maybe to explain more briefly why the scenarios approach, and then maybe outline the 5 scenarios, and then we will take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for your kind introduction and also outlining the whole setup of the process, because that was a process that took more than a year. And I'm very happy that we are finally here presenting to you, dear audience. I will just mention 2 more remarks actually before jumping straight into our scenarios and 5 policy options that we discovered and elaborated on during our the process of our work. First of all, we were aiming for the year of 2030, when the so-called mandate of Vladimir Putin should end. So we are looking for several years of period during which we foresee many things happening. So this is first of them. And a second one, and Adam will then speak about that later, is actually that what we tried to actually bypass and somehow go around was the current rather stalemate type of debate about Russia, which is typical for the current basically that defense and deterrence posture, Western countries supporting Ukraine for the time being, and for Russia taking and considering that as a static object. But of course, this is far more than that. And the mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin last year actually showed very nicely how much more complicated the dynamics inside of Russia is. And this is what we really wanted to point our attention to, and also include on board the policy and decision-making circles within the wider West, in order to actually somehow stimulate the public discussion about what to really do with Russia, because the talks about the Western countries missing any kind of strategy is something that we really consider as detrimental, and that's why we wanted to stimulate this kind of conversation. So that's my second remark, and I will now already go into the five policy options and 5 different scenarios, which I will try to describe briefly, in which in each of the scenarios you will discover when having a look at the publication, which was already published at the page of GMF, AMO, and also KEF just today, you will discover 2 pairs of information that might be actually important to explain. First is the 2 factors that we were orienting ourselves when placing these options on the so-called map, that we created within the nexus that we have created within our thinking. First was the level of authoritarian rule perceived from the centrality of power inside of Russia. And the second was, in fact, an isolation factor in which Russia can be either looking inwards or being very much outward looking, both in terms of spreading the authoritarian practice, but also communicating, for example, with Western countries. So these are 2 important issues that we match always in each of the cases with a set of enabling factors, enabling preconditions, in fact, in order to for the given scenario to actually take place. Because in this current very complicated reality that we are seeing inside of Russia, we really had to establish certain bars in beyond which and with the use of which the scenario options can be actually played out. So that's actually important to say. One more thing that I will mention before jumping into the first one is that you will find in the scenario options 2 very important factors, and these are no strangers to you. This will be the result of the war of Russia against Ukraine and big part of the West. So how this will actually unroll, and what we will see as a result, if the war continues, if the war is ended, which direction it goes. And a second one is, in fact, determining the level of unity within the West. And this will be always very important if the West is basically siding together, and there is a unity across the Atlantic Ocean on these issues when approaching Russia, or there is some kind of turbulence, and that will be also important for our scenarios. And Ada will then later tell you more about the dilemmas from which we will be also basing our recommendations. So to jump straight forward into our scenarios, the number one, which we called after Putin, a shift to domestic focus and Western re-engagement. As the name suggests, there is a series of unexpected events on which we focus in the scenarios, and so the so-called black swans, in which actually Vladimir Putin disappears from the stage, he dies, and this actually opens the way for a number of events to take place. What we were considering in the first option was, in fact, that when the dictator disappears, there is, of course, a space for new type of elite to emerge. And we see that there is a gradual generational change within the elite. And when Russia is still being dragged into the war in Ukraine, while this is happening, anybody who comes after the dictator will actually seek some kind of legitimacy and additional powers, and this, for the new type of leadership which would be coming after Putin, could be the legitimacy, could be sought and also found potentially in cooperation with the Western countries. So that is actually something that we tried to work with within the first scenario. So dictator disappearing, then conditions being different ones inside of Russia, and of course after realizing that there is no point in suppressing the Russian population anymore, then there needs to be some kind of compromise done with the society, potentially also when cooperating with the Western countries in order to boost the legitimacy of the newcomers to the elite, given and conditioned by the willingness of the West to support anybody, especially if the elite is more prone to decrease the level of repressions and make some kind of compromises for inside. The second scenario is actually named Chechnya's power play, shifting dynamics amid the Kremlin's decline. What it suggests, again, in the title already, so there is, again, one unexpected event, and this is Vladimir Putin disappearing from the scene, but then actually a different kind of dynamics is being played. Unlike in the first scenario, which would be very much done around the centrality of power in Moscow and the relationship between the elite and its society, this time it will be about the center and periphery. In this scenario, as suggested in the title, the central role will be played by the regions, and given the specific status of Chechnya, also historically, we were working with this along the lines that there would be a potential disagreement in the post-Putin type of leadership in Moscow with the new with the elite in Chechnya, so that this would actually lead to tensions and potentially with some kind of help from outside, especially from the Gulf countries, potentially Turkey and others, also a level of emancipation of Chechnya from the centrality of power in Moscow. So that's also very important, so that we see this kind of divergence from in between the relationship between the center and the so-called periphery, or some of the ethnic republics, which could then follow the example of Chechnya and go their own way also. So this kind of struggle in between the center and periphery is very much central to this scenario number two. The number three, called Russia's pivot amid Sino-American confrontation, is actually played along different lines. And again, as the title suggests, we might see a much higher level of engagement of the Communist China, People's Republic of China, in support of Russia. This would be, again, conditioned by stepped-up confrontation between the Chinese Communist regime and then the Western countries, headed by the U.S. Sort of confronting the U.S. leadership, not only in Indo-Pacific region, but also more broadly. We could see potentially escalation around Taiwan. That is something very much on the map already today, given the time span that we determined quite possible that this might take, and a fully fledged confrontation between the Chinese Communist regime and the Western countries headed by the United States would also unleash the potential for Chinese support of the Russian war against Ukraine, which would be, in this kind of a course of events, eventually won by Russia, because the West would be very much fragmented, and the US looking in the direction of Indo-Pacific, the Western countries trying to cover up for the loss of US support to Ukraine, but of course very much struggling when it comes to keeping up the pace and supplying Ukraine with all the necessary equipment, especially if we are seeing some turbulent developments both on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. In the United States, maybe a much more isolationist type of leadership might emerge, and also on the European continent, with possibly Marine Le Pen again taking power. Number 4, Russian stalemate, consequences of Ukraine's success, again goes in a different direction. It is one of the optimistic scenarios from the Western point of view, given that there is a consistent support of Western countries towards Ukraine, and a gradual loss of Russia in Ukraine in terms of the war atrocities, and Ukraine winning back a big part of the territory and pushing Russia back. This would indeed mean a big defeat and a PR disaster for Putin. But in our scenario, we are foreseeing that Vladimir Putin would be actually staying in power, so that he would not be toppled by other leaders and the broader Verkhushka type of leadership in the Kremlin, but of course he would be much more weakened. What would emerge would be a high level of factionalism and different parties fighting each other. So Russia would be much more focused inside than outside, and this would, under certain conditions, allow some kind of emancipation of the domestic public again to make benefit of this kind of situation. But as we foresaw, as I mentioned, we would not see in the scenario Vladimir Putin departing, but rather staying weak, and people around him actually taking over gradually. And finally, Ruski Mir is not yet lost. So this is a scenario, this actually incorporating another of the countries of Eastern Europe, which is Belarus, in which we are actually foreseeing that again, with given the consistency in Western support for Ukraine and a gradual pushback against the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the Putin's leadership would need some kind of victory in this case. And the victory could be, in a sense, when perceiving and having a look at the developments inside of Belarus, where we have ever weakening dictator, again, aging dictator of Alexander Lukashenko, which at one point might be actually toppled by Russia, and the so-called union state between Belarus and Russia being much more instrumentalized and eventually leading to Russia completely taking over Belarus, which would essentially mean that there could be some kind of trade-off between Russia and the West in the direction, you West take Ukraine, us in Russia, we are taking and solidifying our control of the Belarusian territory. Both sides basically being somehow satisfied with this, given the condition again that West would be weakened by the ongoing war atrocities and problems that there would occur on the way. So I will probably end right here, Nick. Sorry for speaking a little longer, but I felt that this might be actually of the interest to the audience. As I mentioned, there was we foresaw a number of unexpected events, the so-called black swans, so that we worked with that a lot in order, again, the West and ourselves in the policy and decision-making community not to be caught by surprise in different types of situations that we try to describe in our scenarios. I will end right here and we'll be happy to continue then elaborating if there are any questions, comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you very much, and good timekeeping. So that's not a problem. There's an awful lot. The big subject. It's a big region. There's many different big futures also possibly involved. So just to reiterate, feel free, anybody in the audience, to post comments or chat or questions already in the chat in the Q&A function. We won't get to them just yet, but it's never too early to get them in. Adam, if I can just go back to you, I mean. Just to follow up on the second part of the project and the paper in terms of setting out what the policy implications are and jumping on from that and developing from that what the recommendations that you have come up with through the process of this project. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me right now? Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So right now, a little bit about implications and also recommendations. So first of all, as Pavel has already mentioned, we decided to focus especially on three dilemmas, fundamental questions. And these three dilemmas are as follow: if and under which conditions to intervene in Russian domestic affairs, if and under which conditions to engage with a future Russian leadership, and the last one, how to maintain unity within the EU and NATO. And probably that's the key word, unity. It's like, to paraphrase this famous slogan sentence from Bill Clinton's campaign, it is the economy stupid. In this case, it is the unity stupid, and it's definitely crucial. Let me maybe at the very beginning clarify the issue. What does it mean, Central Eastern Europe, how we define this region? So definitely this term in our case, according to us, covers countries who are the members of so-called the Bucharest format, the Bucharest 9, so stretching from Estonia, then Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Of course, these countries are members of the NATO, and they joined the EU in 2004, 2007. Of course, we can include also Croatia and Slovenia to this category. And I'm not going to discover America or invite the wheel. That, of course, these three dilemmas are of crucial importance and are very relevant for these countries because, of course, the geography matters a lot, the location, of course, because of the fact that they are neighbors of some of these countries of Russia, of Belarus, of Ukraine, or because of the geographical proximity in the case of Czechia. And just to remind you that, for example, Czechia right now has proportionally the largest Ukrainian refugee community in the EU. So that's why, of course, for us, for these countries, these issues, these questions are so important and are of crucial significance. Of course, in that case, just please remember that the entire policy paper, the main text has something like 12 pages. So, of course, don't expect from us that we really had an opportunity to dive very deeply into details, that we, in fact, we presented some kind of framework, certain main ideas which should be developed. Nevertheless, definitely these three fundamental dilemmas questions are of, as I would like to underline, are not only related to the fact that Russia represents for these countries, in our opinion, a fundamental, vital threat to their national interests, sovereignty, security, and even in certain cases, independence. And in that case, of course, from our point of view, the trajectory of Russia, the future of Russia is so important for these countries. Nevertheless, of course, according to our evaluations, assessments, we strongly believe that, of course, these issues are the future of Russia is also strongly intertwined with the domestic developments, internal developments in our countries, and also in the EU and the NATO. And in that case, of course, we are very outspoken on this issue, that we are afraid of certain negative developments concerning political systems in our countries and also in main key EU and NATO member states, including, for example, the US or France, and to a certain degree, of course, a much lesser degree, Germany. These countries are crucial, and of course, their future is also very important. That's maybe it's very basic and obvious for you, but sometimes I think we should recall these basic things. Then, a few words about policy recommendations for the CE countries and then for the EU and the NATO. So we believe that, of course, we should recognize the reality and accept the fact that, of course, the region, the CE, is deeply diverse. If you compare societies and political elites, their attitudes, approaches to the war, to Ukraine, to Russia, you have a really wide scope of different positions, sometimes, of course, a clash of interests, of policies, sometimes within our societies, you can observe this kind of contradictions and tensions. So that's very crucial regarding the future of the region, that what we need very badly is, in fact, to overcome this, or at least to try to find some lowest common denominators among ourselves. I know that sometimes you can accuse us that we are naive, that that's some kind of wishful thinking, but nevertheless, we think we should try at least to establish some coalitions of the willing. Of course, especially countries like Baltic states, Czechia, Poland, Romania, these countries especially, they should try to be as assertive and proactive in the EU and the NATO concerning debates on common strategy towards Russia, on the future of Russia, of course. And in this case, we need to be constructive, innovative, and of course, to present some concrete ideas, plans concerning the future of Russia and these various scenarios. Of course, in that case, we need also to pay attention to future Russian elites and Russian diaspora, which is located in our countries and generally in the EU and the NATO. And here, of course, I would like to stress that, underline, that's very important for me, that we need to reflect much more than right now the countries, Russia's ethnic and regional diversity, taking to a consideration that we have non-Russian nations of Russia, and we have also migrants, people of migrant background in Russia, and we need to engage these communities, their representatives, much more in discussions about the future of Russia. And we also strongly believe that, of course, if we need to achieve at least a partial democratization of Russia, some positive developments of Russia, we need to engage these people, because Russia should become finally a genuine federation. And of course, in that case, we need to be a clear and consistent advocates of the integration of Ukraine, Moldova, maybe in the future Georgia, and even Armenia into the EU and the NATO. And of course, here, of course, I believe that the best pupils in the class are probably Baltic states concerning the military, economic, and financial support for Ukraine proportionally to the size of their economies. And of course, that's the benchmark for the region as such, because still there is a quite huge room of improvement and we can perform better. And of course, we should also take into consideration and reflect on our own weaknesses, biases, some prejudices concerning Russia, its future, its history, identity, and so on. I'm coming from Poland, so as you know, for instance, in our country, even serious people can talk a lot about Genghis Khan, Mongols, this kind of heritage legacy concerning Russia, calling Russia's Asians despots, and so on. So in that case, of course, we need also to think critically about this issue. And finally, we need, of course, to consult more, to organize more meetings of officials and discuss within the region on this issue. That's also a window of opportunity for us to persuade the reluctant actors in the region, like Slovakia, like Hungary, for instance, to refrain from open opposition to the mainstream Western position on Russia. And then we are moving to the EU and the West, and policy recommendations for them. So again, the unity is of crucial importance for us. We think that we need to be united in order to respond to developments in Russia, negative and positive ones. And of course, in that case, a transatlantic dialogue on the future of Russia is of really key significance, in our opinion, that we need, in fact, in that case, the EU sometimes must take the lead in this dialogue, since, in fact, for us, for Europe, the future of Russia is much still more important than for the US. In the case of some negative developments, we will be affected the most, of course. We need to invest in our defense posture, in deterrence of Russia, of course, in again the support of Ukraine. We of course postulate to increase and to strengthen this issue in this dimension, our commitments and engagement, involvement. Of course, for us, the security of our countries is very important. So that's why we think that the increase of military deployment of the NATO in the region is more than welcome. We need new bases, new of course, soldiers on the ground. That's very important. Again, like in the case of the region, the EU and the NATO should engage much more with the democratic Russian diaspora. And I would like to stress that, taking into account the diversity of Russia. Of course, we should think about, for instance, how we can tighten the sanctions and introduce additional measures. Especially this top-down approach is more than welcome in our opinion, and we should target much more lower ranks of Russia's nomenclature. And finally, probably we should discuss what is also crucial regarding the future of Russia, how we can pre-agree on certain basic fundamental conditions to be met by Moscow in the case of some kind of normalization process at some point, rapprochement, especially the issue of lifting the sanctions is crucial. And in that case, again, the EU and NATO should be prepared for this scenario. And I will stop here, and I'm giving right now the floor to Nick.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a very good overview of the rest of the paper, building on what Pavel has said. And I think it's a good jumping point to go, I think, to Kadri, because you mentioned a lot about, obviously, the policy implications for the EU. So Kadri will give not only that, but I think, given her perspective and her interests and specialism, I think she can certainly put this in a broader EU context as well. But generally speaking, of course, your entire reactions to the scenarios and the project. Thank you, Kadri.
Thanks a lot, and thank you very much for inviting me to comment. These scenarios were extremely interesting read, and it made me think deeply. Because it sort of communicated to me that we are all maybe much more influenced by our experiences than we actually think. I see it on myself. I often get Russia wrong these days, especially when I look at the state-society relations, and I always tend to expect a much stronger pushback from the society than actually happens. And then I feel miserable, misled, failed as an analyst. And I realized that that is because I spent my formative years during Perestroika era. That shaped my view of Russia. And back then, society, but also intelligentsia, were much more powerful forces with their own views and voice than in today's Russia. So actually, I even undertook a somewhat larger research to think it through and to help myself to come to terms with new realities. I felt I was not living in 21st century. And to be honest, I see also a lot of impressions from the past and even past trauma in these scenarios. And just to highlight a few issues where I disagree with, or I question some of the assumptions. The whole assumption that a weakened Russian leadership will want to reach out to the West, not least because society demands that is compromise between the Kremlin and society. I'm not sure of that at all. I mean, why would they reach out to the West? They are much more likely to be helped by powers other than the West. And I don't think society demands that either. Maybe a certain layer of elites for whom West was convenient place to go as tourist, and that is now complicated. Then the whole nature of separatism, I think that replicates the experience of 1990s when we saw republics threatening to secede, to break away. There was a huge war between Chechnya and the central Moscow. Why would Chechnya want to secede? No, I mean they have such a hold over Russia and resources supplied by the Kremlin that is very convenient. Where would they go and why? I think, their leverage over Moscow enhances their position in the Islamic world, their connections to the Islamic world actually make them a factor in Moscow. And as long as they play it well, and as long as Kremlin is not entirely impoverished, but I don't think we can foresee impoverishment on the level of early 90s. I think Chechnya is much better off inside Russia, and likewise many other republics. I mean, to trade with central power is much more useful for local elites, definitely. Maybe not for societies, but the elites are very good in that game. Then what I also see, I see a trauma of the West talking with Russia and legitimizing Russia regardless of what Russia does. That is what Central and Eastern Europe saw throughout much of 90s, early 2000s, really until the annexation of Crimea. And I wonder to what extent we should fear that now. I think actually for the West, as far as I can tell, Putin's comeback in 2011 was a wake-up call in a way. That's what made many countries realize that, okay, Russia is actually not democratizing. Earlier, I was thinking that Russia is another country of Central Europe. They will democratize. There are setbacks, detours, but eventually they will get there. I think 2011 and especially then later 2014 gave them a sign that Russia is on another trajectory at all. And the question of talking with Russia remains a pertinent one. And I don't think we have unanimity in Europe on how to do, under what conditions. But I would completely exclude a scenario where West will be helping out Russian elites while we still wage war in Ukraine. But I just cannot see that. And also, I think emphasis on Western unity. Okay, if Donald Trump comes back and takes his own track on Russia, then we will have a unity issue, and that will be a serious one. But for now, listen, the West has been united ever since 22. And even so, we probably have not managed to act in an optimal manner. So it's not a unity question. It's a question of what would be good and smart policies, and how to figure that out in time. And also, I think Putin is a weakened leader who needs to sell Belarus to society to make himself palatable. I don't know. To me, that's an echo of Yeltsin in 1996, when actually the idea of union state was first drafted in Russia. I think that if Russia loses in Ukraine, that will be really hard situation for Putin, because he has staked everything on Ukraine. That is true. But knowing Putin's character, just lingering on, being weakened, like Yeltsin in the second half of 90s, that's not quite like him. I think he either goes with a bang or tries to escalate again, mobilize society, be even more authoritarian, and escalate standoff with the West. So there are many things that I find slightly unrealistic in the scenarios, but nevertheless, I think it was a very good exercise. And actually, I would suggest you to repeat it with a slightly different composition of participants. Why don't you take someone from Germany, Italy, France, but also to invite some exiled Russians to join, those who have left after 22 and have sort of their own instincts about Russian political landscape and Russian political trajectory that could inform thinking on those kinds of scenarios. So I would be very eager to see a volume 2 done in slightly different composition of participants.
Thank you very much, Kadri. Just as a quick note, not to preempt anything that Adam and Pavel might say, but in the process, at least in some of the discussions, we did include some Russians experts, so not necessarily exiles in the literal sense of people who were there as exile or immigrants, but from experts who are now outside of the country. So there was also a voice from that perspective involved. But thank you for your suggestion. I'm sure that it will be taken on board very eagerly by Adam and Pavel for future reference and for future work. On that note, I think I'll hand over to Eleonora and maybe give us a little bit of a perspective, also a little bit from the other parts of Europe, shall we say, on top of your general reactions to the project in the same way. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will start straight from the last point that Kadri mentioned. We need this exercise made at a wider European level, because this was one of the main points I had noted down. It's very good to have a viewpoint from Central and Eastern Europe. It's good to have your leadership. Actually, I think one of our when I say our, I mean, Southern European original sins was to ignore the threats coming from Russia that you were pointed to. And I would encourage, people and analysts and politicians from your region not to do the same with our perspectives and the fears, because sometimes I feel that finding this lowest common denominator that Adam was talking about is very difficult. We have a very different risk perception in here, which is normal. It's geography. I mean, our airspace doesn't get violated by Russian jets. We haven't had any history of being invaded, at least in physical terms, by Russia. So I think we must find this lowest common denominator before we turn to the US and we establish this transatlantic dialogue that you very rightly say it's important to have in the report. Just on this, a very short anecdote. I was in Riga before the summer, and I was asked more or less the same. I was tasked with the same thing, to give the perspective from a Southern European state. We have a totally different understanding and risk perception in Italy compared to any of the Baltic states or any of the of Poland or or Finland, because we don't feel, the average Italian doesn't feel we are at war. Of course, there is relatively high support for Ukraine, but we just don't feel we are at war with anybody. While of course the perception is quite different in your region. So going back to the report, I won't repeat many of the things that were said already. Just say I really liked the methodology that you chose. I myself wrote a policy paper on the future of EU-Russia relations and recommended first to have this exercise made in Brussels at the European institutions level, because it's really important. And what I would do, you mentioned two factors that you wrote for every scenario: the level of authoritarian rule and the level of international isolation. Now, reading the report, it came across that more than level of isolation for Russia was more like level of isolation from the West, which I think is, as Kadri said, it's an important variable, but probably it's not even the most important one. I would suggest to include two more factors for every scenario: the level of likelihood and the level of threat that the scenario poses to the West. And then one very good thing that I really liked, despite, of course, the very little amount of pages that you had, you managed to highlight the need to reflect on your biases. And I think everybody, of course, has biases, but it's very good to acknowledge and to reflect on them. And this is all the more important since many of us Russia experts cannot actually go to Russia at the moment. So one thing that I also feel very strongly about is, reflecting on my own limitations, writing about Russia without traveling to the country, because at least I am not doing it. One thing that I would recommend regarding the recommendations is to expand the point on engaging with the Russian diaspora. I would be much more concrete, and I would also highlight the dilemmas that this engagement with the Russian diaspora poses. In other words, how do we strike a balance between very rational national security preoccupations and letting a border open for Putin opponents of people fleeing from Russia? Because the border is closed for, like, when it comes to many countries in the region to Russians. How do we strike a balance between providing a safe space for Russian exiled media, for example, and being sure that they don't hurt our sensitivities or they don't break the law? And I'm thinking now about Dost, TV Rain in Latvia being shut down in December 2022. And so there are a lot of complications that arise from this attempt to engage with the Russian diaspora. So if I were you, if I had to choose the one recommendation that to expand and to think it through, then I would choose this one, because it's, I think, the most important, but at the same time, one of the most important, but at the same time also a bit tricky to carry out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. Much to ponder and much to get back. Pavel, Adam, I'll give you a moment to quickly, or as comprehensively as you want, respond. There's a lot to pick up, so you can either divide it between yourselves or you can be selective. There are also questions in the chat which are lined up to go, but please, from the audience, feel free to add some more. I will also, while Pavel and Adam are talking, post the link to the paper, which is, I wanted to maybe let you speak before putting the link up so that we had your full attention, but people can be able also access it from the chat in a moment. So maybe Pavel first with you and then back to Adam.
Thank you so much, Nick. I just wanted to go back to some of the points, and thank you so much for all the comments that Kadri and Eleonora actually made to us. It's really useful and of course stimulating, and it would be indeed interesting to have another iteration of this and to go further. And we are considering how to do it and which parts to expand on. But starting with some of the comments that you made, Kadri, I think they were very, very much important. And I just wanted to clarify some of those, because what you mentioned is so right in the first comment that why would the new leadership turn to the West? It wouldn't, but in the course of events that we tried to describe, following a certain order of events, when you wouldn't have Putin to rely on, you wouldn't have repressions with depleted resources when engaged in the war in Ukraine, working against the domestic public, which would start feeling the economic consequences of the war atrocities more and more. So once this automatic reflex of the regime is not working and the repression would not work, then a kind of leadership that would after that emerge would seek for some kind of support to stay in power. So that was sort of a bridge event to where we wanted to focus our attention, and where one of the dilemmas presented by Adam, in fact, actually lies under which conditions, exactly what you mentioned, under which conditions the West should actually talk to Russians, anything in connection to Russia. What are the red lines that we want to have in place for sure if we want to some kind of not normalization of relations, but reestablishing relations at all? So this is the big question that emerges out of that, and out of the necessity that will be coming from inside of Russia when the post-Putin leadership will be seeking some kind of legitimacy. In any case, yes, the first automatic reflex and resource will be repression against anybody. We saw that after in the time after Stalin, that would most likely repeat itself in some shape and form. So what if we imagine that this wouldn't actually work, and there would be a progressive, more progressive part of the liberal elite that would actually enter the scheme? They would be looking for allies. Then we could imagine to them looking westwards rather than Chinawards and elsewhere. So that was something that we very sometimes artificially wanted to create these kind of situations, even if still creating conditions in which the scenario would be plausible under some conditions. What you mentioned, secondly, in terms of the separatism, again, why would Chechnya nowadays turn away from Russia? It wouldn't, again. It wouldn't. But what we try to create as a symptomatic situation is that this inflow of cash would be stopped. Again, in a situation in which you wouldn't have this personal type of relationship between Putin and Kadyrov that would be broken by one of them or both of them. In fact, even both of them leaving. This would require some kind of reset in the relations between Moscow and Chechnya. So we can use this word maybe. And what if these relations and negotiations about how much money goes to North Caucasus actually fail? What if there is no cash flowing to Chechnya? So then of course that would create a situation in which Chechnya would be interested in maintaining the financial inflows, but maybe from somewhere else. And of course, why would they be interested in staying as part of Russian Federation for longer? So again, that was the kind of situation that we tried to create. I somehow covered this third point when you spoke about the trauma from inside of the West, and certainly the Central Eastern European part of that. When talking to Russia, in one of the scenarios, we try to play with a type of situation in which we would have some of the usual suspects from the past, not now, but from the past, in Germany, in France, in possibly the United States even, pushing for this kind of going back to normal, the business, the German companies, the French companies that are still in Russia, lobbying their way through, and so on and so forth. So this would put the Central Eastern European countries in a very delicate position. And again, how they should be talking to the rest of the European Union countries and the rest of Europeans in general. So that would be, again, a big question mark that we wanted to pose and put on the table. How should we do it? Which channels to use? How to talk to the leadership of countries that not necessarily always seeing the things through the same prism. Eleonora spoke about the Italian reality. I think it's quite telling in this example, right? What is the public appetite for not doing business with Russia in the future, in 7 years period, in Italy? Let's be honest. So this is the kind of situation that we again wanted to put on the table. And I will stop right here, even if I very much agree with the points that were made by Eleonora and the point about diaspora. I think it's very, very important. And the dilemma that we are seeing, national security versus having some kind of access to information from inside of Russia or through the people outside back to Russia, that I think is a huge discussion and a big question mark that is over that. How to access the reliable, credible information from today's Russia with the help of those guys on our own, with pursuing different channels. That will be, I think, quite important also in this sense. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pavel. Adam, do you want to follow up on that?
Maybe just a little bit. Let me build on that what has been already said by Pavel and elaborate. Maybe two issues that I would like to touch upon. First of all, regarding scenarios. Generally, our idea was to present really variety, a wide scope of various scenarios with different probability. And of course, it doesn't mean that each of them is inevitable. That's something basic, but we should remind that. And in that case, of course, personally, I can say that, okay, regarding, for example, this weakened Russian elite, why we can expect that, of course, a more probable scenario that, of course, we have China. We need to take into consideration that, of course, we should not expect that China will undertake the policy of wait and see, but has its own interests and so on regarding Russia. But nevertheless, we assumed in the case of this particular scenario that the Russian political elite would acknowledge, recognize that probably a lesser evil for them still, maybe they will, it's going to be something they will be very reluctant, but nevertheless they will recognize it's a lesser evil to have some kind of rapprochement, reconciliation with the West, than to strengthen this very asymmetrical relationship with China, and became, of course, right now, even what we can observe, that Russia slowly is becoming this process. We can say that even it has accelerated since the full-scale invasion, becoming a puppet state, a junior partner of China, with all strings attached in this case. Of course, the same is I think this kind of evaluation is relevant of Chechnya. We can imagine post-Kadyrov Chechnya. We can imagine this kind of scenario that right now, yes, I agree with Kadri that right now we can say from the point of view of this totalitarian regime which is ruling Chechnya, is much more reasonable to be supported by Moscow and be loyal. That's for sure. But of course, in the case of this particular scenario, we can imagine that we can have a different context, and in that case, different calculations, and something can change in Chechnya, inside, or also in Russia as such. In that case, we are talking about a very serious internal crisis. which will create a completely new context. And of course, Kadri has already mentioned the beginning of 90s. Yeltsin's area, and again here we can mention that at that time it was the usual suspects that at that time experts foresaw that we could expect a conflict in Chechnya, and it happened. There were also huge ethnic riots against Russians, for ethnic Russians in Tuva, for instance, and that was also the usual suspect. And Tatarstan as this republic that raised the issue that we officially, formally declared independence. That was not recognized. So in that case, of course, my point is that I think that we should think in such a way that situation is that something very obvious and basic, very dynamic, and we should take into consideration different factors and fact that these calculations of certain actors can change to a large degree. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'll take a couple of questions from the chat. Some of them I think you've sort of touched upon in the discussion, but I think they could be also maybe elaborated or taken into certain directions. And they both, I think, touch on the question of the importance of unity, which one of the member of the audience raised. I would also possibly, I mean, we've talked about possibly the unity question in the sense of within the EU, between Western, Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. I would also actually ask the question of the unity of purpose and of thought within CEE, which, at least from our organization's point of view, is a very broad region, which goes from the Baltics to Baku. So it's we can see it's many countries that are involved there. And I connect that. We also have a question in what is the role of the concept of intermarium, which plays into this, which you don't necessarily have yourself to answer, Adam, because it's a Polish concept. But you also have talked about the different, I think you mentioned the Bucharest Nine. So within that constellation of many Central and Eastern European countries, we see permutations and potential alignments or realignments, or if you don't want to go to the level of calling division. But clearly we have countries like Hungary, which is a particular positioning. We'll see Slovakia under a certain government, but also countries basically like Bulgaria after one of its elections. So this can we interrogate a little bit this question of unity, and also in a very practical terms, that question of like what formats for policy towards Russia? Because is it purely then a question of bilateral country level policymaking or EU level policymaking? But there's a lot of potential formats and initiatives that are either existing or potentially could be created to do this. So I think if we could like address a little bit more this question of unity within at least within the CEE countries, broadly, very broadly defined. I don't know who wants to go first. Pavel, I think you're
maybe we can start with Adam this time, because I know that he spent a lot of time on this unity and also intermarium.
So first of all, I think that still, in fact, I wanted to raise this issue. I forgot to do that in my previous intervention, that I think that really the unity matters a lot. It should be taken for granted. In the case of our policy paper, in fact, we have this perspective until 2030. So in that perspective, this unity is even more important that right now. I think it's of crucial significance because of the developments that I mentioned, for example, in the US, in France, also in the region, in the Central European countries, that we can see certain serious challenges to the unity. And in fact, I think that we got used to this unity after 2 years, but still you can see serious cracks. And also during these 2 years, that was sometimes quite challenging to convince our societies engaged in dialogue with ordinary people and encourage them to support certain difficult decisions. So I think it's at the first glance something basic, but it isn't obvious, this unity. issue, and the same in the case of the region. If you look at these domestic developments, of course, right now there is a very huge synergy overlapping of positions between Poland and Czechia concerning the policies of both countries towards the war, Russia, Ukraine, and so on. But nevertheless, please remember that Czechia will hold elections next year, national elections, and we can have a different government with a different policy and closer to Slovakia or Hungary, unfortunately. So the situation is dynamic, changing. Definitely, as Nick has already mentioned, we can observe that there is a fragmentation. We have also certain regions that, for example, definitely from the point of view of Poland, you can find allies, especially in the Baltic states, in the Nordic states, the Netherlands, for instance, the UK, and so on. And on the other hand, as you know, Poland is very consistent principle concerning Russia, but nevertheless, you can observe serious bilateral tensions between Poland and Ukraine. So the picture is really complex and really complicated. Probably that's a paradox. The region as such, the Central Eastern Europe, is more diverse and complex than, for instance, Southern Europe or Northwestern Europe. So in that case, of course, there is an issue of intermarium, these three Cs initiative, Adriatic Sea, Baltic Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea. And of course, in that case, as you know, this initiative was very strongly promoted by the previous Polish government, but nevertheless, still this idea of development of cooperation on the north-south axis between these seas, especially concerning energy infrastructure, railways, highways, of course, there is increasing awareness that it's also it's beneficial for the entire region, and it also has implications for policies towards our neighbors in the Western Balkans and in the Eastern Europe. And but nevertheless, I would say that working and writing this policy paper, frankly speaking, in my case, I didn't think so much about the Eastern, about Trimarium. Rather, I focused with Pavel on this Bucharest 9 and general the Eastern flank. That was probably the main point of reference for us regarding geopolitical dimension and geography of the region.
Thanks, Adam. Kadri and Eleonora, I'm conscious that you may be under some time pressure, so I don't know if, Kadri, if you would like to come in and comment on anything that's been said by Adam, or if you want to, I can then throw the next question otherwise.
Yeah, we could always comment, but just one remark that in response to my comments was said that new Russian leadership needs legitimacy and the West would be the source of it. I think a lot will depend also on what the West will be like. I mean, are we any kind of source of legitimacy for anyone, even least Russia? And also a capacity to shape anything in Russia. I would question that too. But otherwise, yeah, better go to the next question. Otherwise, we could spend the whole evening in nice conversation.
Absolutely. I think it's good. You mentioned the West, so that will give me a good jumping point. Because, Eleonora, we have a question in the Q&A regarding BRICS. And I think that also connects a little bit to the point you were making about the question of who is isolated from whom, a little bit in the methodology and in these discussions, which I think is a very crucial point. So I think that connects also to the broader geopolitical alignments that are on the other side of the equation for Russia. So I wonder if you could maybe take a little bit more. And of course, we had a question of the enlarged BRICS, of the much greater non-Western groupings taking shape. and also possibly one particular country, which I know you know well, which is Turkey, which is a very crucial element in this because it is very much in a pivotal position between these different constellations. So maybe you could talk a little bit much more about this.
Exactly. Well, I think there has been a lot of discussion about the BRICS being an increasingly cohesive group and an increasingly attractive group for other countries. But I think sometimes these two things are mistaken for active support for Russia. I don't think that the two things should be equated because simply because for many BRICS countries, almost all BRICS countries that refuse basically to break ties with Russia, the relationship with Moscow is simply pragmatic. It makes sense. Their prism from which they see the relationship is the prism of national interest. Doing business with Russia, buying heavily discounted oil and gas. This is something that for them is not necessarily does not necessarily contrast with their own the broader geopolitical positioning. So they think that, I mean, as things stands, of course, as things stands, and if there is no nuclear escalation, for instance, that would force them to choose a side, they think they can go on in this ambiguity. And this is exactly the situation for Turkey, which also wants or is interested in joining the BRICS, and is also one of the only NATO member who's observing in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is this Russia-China-led organization, very active, especially in Central Asia, but that too is expanding, right? And Turkey is a particularly interesting case, not only because, you know, it's the country that I know best, but also because, contrary to India or China, for instance, Turkey took a very clear stance from the very beginning, condemning the annexation of Crimea in 2014, how Russia was persecuting Tatars, which of course, as you know, are a Turkic ethnic group, condemning the full-scale invasion, even at the UN, while India and China often just abstain from the votes. So Turkey is a perfect example of how a country that is incredibly and increasingly jealous of its autonomous foreign policy can both be in good terms, more or less, with the West, and being a member of organizations such as NATO, and keeping a good relationship as well with Moscow. And this is, of course, risky for Turkey. We all know the dangers of being energy dependent on Russia. But, you know, for the time being, this is something that makes sense for Turkey, for other BRICS countries. And even if a political change happened in Ankara as of tomorrow, I don't think its Russia policy would change much.
Thank you, Eleonora. I'll just pick a couple of questions because we have about 10-15 minutes left, and I know Pavel wants to come back on a certain point, so I'll come back to you first on that. A couple of questions also. One which we have, and I'll summarize, is a question that I think we've sort of touched about in the discussion, and also regarding Chechnya, is in terms of the Russia's ethnic minorities. That whole debate about decolonization and engagement, I think it also overlaps a little bit with the question of diasporas. I mean, what would you be, and this is for all of you, but I'll start with you, Pavel, at least, what would be your view in terms of engaging with this debate in purely policy matters? Because I think it's intellectually, it's a concept that's now taking up gathering speed as a discussion. In practical terms, in the context of saying what to do with Russia over the next 5-6 years, I mean, do you see for the Central and Eastern Europeans and for the rest of the Western community also ways of engagement with this in practical terms into the question of decolonization and ethnic minorities? And on the back of that, I think also the more specific implications in terms of engaging with the political diasporas, because I think there's also a lot of overlap there. So I'll come back to you, Pavel, because I know you wanted to also further refine a point. And then if you could pick up on this question of ethnic minorities and decolonization in a very practical as opposed to ethical or intellectual sense.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's actually a good segue to what I wanted to mention, because I think what also Kadri mentioned is that there is a big sort of homework ahead of us in the West, inside of the European Union, in order to actually consolidate. We don't have to call it unity, but we need some level of consolidation on what to do with Russia in the future. And that was one of the center questions that we really wanted to answer, because if we ask ourselves, are we, after 2.5 years of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, getting more consolidated, more united, or we see fragments? I would incline to say the latter. So we are not by far as united as we were in the first days of 2022. And I think this might, over the next couple of year perspective, get only worse. So that's actually something that motivated us to not only open this conversation, but also to push and open up the debate about establishing maybe a new line of sort of our approach towards Russia. Call it a strategy, call it something else, but to replace what we used to have in the 5 guiding principles and some of the restored ones and so on. So we will need some lines to take in the future, in the years to come, and in order to stay on the same page. And I think here, what will be definitely part of that is to somehow prepare also for the day after. And there were already events on this topic, what happens after Putin leaves, or what happens after the war ends, and so on, the day after, so to say. So that's something also which I think will definitely require the presence and participation of the ethnic communities inside of Russia. Many of the analysts and observers of domestic developments inside of Russia, they say, look, this is not by far sort of the determining factor at this point, at least, but that this can first of all change in the future. And also, and this is, I think, a common point for everybody who thinks about more democratic future for Russia than, and by all means, any better future than we have now for Russia, realizes that there will need to be a significant shift of power from the center towards the region. We might actually have a look at what Ukraine has done in terms of the decentralization reform. We can call it a process of true federalization of Russia, anything of that sort, of which actually the ethnic minorities and the original nations of Russia, actually, they are part of, and they should be part of the conversation for sure, actually. Also by the simple setup of the Russian Federation, so-called federation, at least for the time being now. So I think this is definitely somewhere where we should be focusing when having a look at the policy perspectives, what we should be focusing on, and where should be ourselves in the West also preparing for the day after. So to say. One more thing that I wanted to actually mention, or 2 points, if you allow, if I may come back to what Eleonora mentioned actually about how the study can be further improved and moved further. So to establish the 2 more factors in terms of the likelihood and the threat perception, I think it's a great idea, but it also somehow requires a little bit different approach that we were taking so far. The strategic foresight is less about determining likelihood and determining, for example, percentage points on how likely is this or that, unlike forecasting, but actually that is something that we are all also looking at when having contacts with some forecaster teams, so that we would actually add some additional characteristics to these scenarios, because of course, when perceived from Western decision makers' point of view, we will definitely need to make them relevant, and they are very much different levels of relevancy at this point, and we also, Kadri spoke about it, Adam also spoke about it. So definitely that's one way forward. And the threat perception, yes, I think this is also a good characteristic that we should be also adding. And last point, if you allow me, there was one more question that Adam, I think, tried to also unpack in describing the dilemmas actually that are ahead of us. And one of them, and this is something that we already saw when observing the mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin, is how, and if at all, the West should get engaged inside of domestic Russian affairs. Should we actually pick allies from inside of Russia when these kind of rupture events emerge, or should we just be silently observing of what's happening and let them, the Russians, the Russian Federation citizens, deal with that, or not? So again, what should be the line to take in case of either internal struggles inside of the power vertical, struggles on the center periphery axis, struggle against along the lines of ethnic type of violence that we have seen recently, also again from time to time always erupting in the region of North Caucasus, most notably. So are we just supposed to sit back, relax, and watch, or should we get a much more proactive role? So that was one of the questions that we also wanted to put on the table when outlining the dilemmas for the West as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavel. Adam or Eleonora or Kadri, do you want to come back on this? I think Adam, maybe you wanted to. I'll go Kadri first, and then Adam, if you don't mind.
I do, yeah, because something what you mentioned is concerning minorities. That is something I feel quite strongly about. I mean, I agree it would be good for Russia if it had more power in the regions. I sometimes tell Russians that Estonia is actually a bigger and wealthier country than Russia, meaning that we have much more diverse regional cultures, dialects, etc. And the state supports them, and all Estonians are proud, but we don't actually understand one another. If you travel from west to southwest, you can encounter dialects that you don't understand. And Russia has that instinct to be unitary, and Russia really has less in terms of regional cultures in Russian-speaking regions, if you discount national minorities. So all is well and good, but I don't think it is us who should be making that point and pushing it forcefully, because we are seen as enemies. If a whole issue of federalization and cultural autonomy and whatnot is seen in the Kremlin or Moscow, even post-Putin Moscow, a sort of Western agenda, which is right now enemy's agenda, then they are inclined to do the opposite. And where I feel really strongly is about Finno-Ugric nations. Being an Estonian, I'm a Finno-Ugric, and there aren't that many of us. There are 14 million Hungarians, then there are 5 million something Finns, 1 million Estonians, and then a plethora of small nations on the territory of Russian Federation, all smaller than 1 million, some as small as a few hundred people, or even 20. So I want them to survive with their languages and with their cultures, but that actually means that we in the West should refrain from associating their cultural rights with our politics, because that is bad for them and that is bad for their agenda. If we demand independence for, I don't know, Udmurtia or Mari, that will likely mean that all national activists in those kinds of places will be put in jail by Putin because he sees as a threat. So myself, I have done quite a sharp U-turn on that issue. I remember that when I actually started working on Russia and on these minorities back in the 1990s, I suggested, yeah, you know, demand rights, leave Russia, why stay there? You know, I urged them to do what Estonia had just done. And now actually I am very cautious about how we speak about it. And I think Westerners who sort of speak about independence of, I don't know, Ersas or Mokshas or Hantis, Mansis, I find it highly irresponsible. I mean, they are playing with that idea in their cozy homes in wherever in the West, whereas, you know, for people on the ground, that is actually existential danger, potentially. So I really urge caution and responsibility on these kinds of things.
Thank you very much, Kadri. Adam, before I go to you, we have 4 minutes left. I would like not to impose more on anybody within that. So if you could maybe speak for 3 minutes, and then I'll have the last one.
Okay, so I will be like Shinkansen or TGV. So in that case, of course, Kadri is right. We should be cautious. Certain ideas that right now will support separatist independent movements. We should take into account that these people can pay the price for this kind of ideas, collective responsibility, so sort of collateral damage. Nevertheless, of course, at the same time, again, we should prepare ourselves that very often in the history of Russia, we can start from the beginning of the 17th century, the time of troubles, then after the First World War, during the Second World War, and then finally the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Of course, Russia, and that's crucial, and we should underline that again and again. The current federation of Russia is not like the Soviet Union concerning the ethnic composition. That's very important, just to remind you. And the same in the case of the Tsarist Russia, which both countries, the Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, were much, much more ethnically heterogeneous than the current Russia. Nevertheless, we can prepare ourselves that in a certain condition, some kind of regime collapse, power vacuum, this ethnic issue will re-emerge. And definitely we need to have certain ideas, plans for this kind of crisis management, how to engage, what to do, how to react in that case. And that's the only thing that I would like to stress, and I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you, Pavel. Eleonora, do you want to have one last quick word or only thing? No, okay. In that sense, I'll just maybe bring this to a close right on time. Thank you so very much to, in no particular order, Kadri, Adam, Eleonora, and Pavel for this discussion. It will be on YouTube on the GMF channel in the coming days, so we will be sharing this also. Just as a reminder, the link to the paper is on there. I'm sorry, there's a couple of questions we couldn't get to. I think one of them may be covered slightly by looking at the fully detailed paper. I will just add I will merge one question which and / comment with a conclusion of my own to wrap up the conversation, which is that these scenarios of foresight exercise are usually, I find, more useful in the exercise than in the product, in the forcing us to think. It is actually putting ourselves through the mental processes and obstacles that these things are. And I think it's easy to get fixated on likelihood, on whether this is realistic or probabilistic. I hope that this exercise and reading about its output has value purely as a jogging our mental capacity to address questions and making us think about it. One comment or question that we had which connects to this is, of course, one of our audience said that the 2030 was too long a viewpoint to take, and that things could move very much more quickly, and we need also more short-term scenarios and contingencies, which I think is very true. And I think thinking about it in scenario terms should help us doesn't necessarily force us, doesn't necessarily make us committed to thinking only in that medium term. The processes of this kind of exercise can also increase our policy muscle to deal with emergency and short-term situation, because our short-term reactions will have to fit into a medium and longer-term process anyway. I think also from my sort of final point on this, which is, I don't know if it's a counterfactual or a factual, given that all scenarios are in a way counterfactual. We need also to think in terms of what if there is no scenario, what if there is just an ongoing stasis and no great change or turnaround in Russia, that we don't know how long the regime will last or that Putin himself will last. There is certainly a possibility that this will go on beyond 2030. And I think this exercise also helps us to think how to deal with the lack of change as much as of a lack of dramatic change, as opposed to potential different dramatic scenarios. I very much enjoyed this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it too. I will look forward to seeing you on future events. We hope to do more events related to Russia in the coming months. And please watch this space and social media on, as they say, for this. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.